Hi, everybody. Welcome to La Lista, a Latinx writers podcast. I am your host, Ruben Mendive. Today, I have a brand new guest here in the Nook in my kitchen. So I always like to ask my guests to introduce themselves. So your name, who you are, how you identify for the audience at home.
Gotcha. My name is Christina Piña. I go by Chrissy, like Chrissy Teigen. Just more fun and friendly. And I identify as a Cuban American Latinx writer, TV writer predominantly, but do some features. And yeah, that's mostly actually what I write.
So my second question that I ask people is, where are you from? And just like whatever that means to you.
That is a big question then.
Yeah.
I'm from Miami, Florida. I was born and raised there circa 1990, millennial AF. I am first generation Cuban American. Technically my father is first generation, I will say. He was born in Miami, but he came fresh off literally a coyote's boat from Cuba. So he's technically first generation, but he is such a unique onion of a human that he really doesn't identify as first generation. He sees himself as an immigrant. Mm-hmm. My mom came over from Cuba in 1968 when she was 9 years old. And the last thing she remembers seeing in Cuba, literally the night before she left, was Disney's animated Sleeping Beauty, which is actually my favorite Disney film.
Yeah.
Didn't even relate the two until she told me that story. So my parents came over in the late 60s. My father probably a little earlier. They grew up in Carroll City, Hialeah, at least for my mom. And my dad grew up in Miami, but then eventually, when he was really young, moved to Chicago and predominantly grew up in Chicago, all over the place. I actually know a lot about my parents' stories, and why that informs me growing up in Miami was because the past never left us. So, for instance, my dad's dad, my grandfather, worked in a slaughterhouse and would come home with blood on his hands and did that job for a couple days and quit, and then never really learned English or worked again. And my mom, my grandma, my dad's mom, was the breadwinner of the family in the 60s, 70s when it was very uncommon. And so she worked as a nurse, which is crazy because my grandma's amazing and I love her, but she's a very crude, sarcastic woman. So I really wonder how that worked out for her in Chicago. And at the time, my grandma, even though she doesn't like to publicly talk about it, and I am blowing her up by saying this, but it is a big part of my identity, was she started to get into Santeria. She obviously knew of it in Cuba. It's a very predominant religion there, at least at the time, perhaps. I don't know about the statistics today. And she didn't have a lot of Cuban friends. And being an immigrant, that's all she wanted to do was have Cuban friends. And all the Cuban women she knew in Chicago were, of Afro-Latin descent. So even though my grandfather was brown and my grandma was white, my dad was brown. I'm brownish. And then, and when I tan, I'm really brown, surprisingly, or not surprisingly. And essentially my dad watched his mom be the breadwinner and also practice Santeria. So she became a santera, which is a very long, drawn-out process. You basically give yourself to a saint or Orisha, which is like a Santeria god, for like a year, and wear white for a year, and you can't have sex on certain days. And like, it's a weird, long, drawn-out thing. And my dad would come home from school and she would be possessed and her eyes would be rolled back in her head and she'd be speaking in tongues and be half naked. And I cannot begin to tell you how often she's still done that, even as I've grown up. So, and the reason I talk about her and my father so much is that my grandma came to live with me when I was born. So and she still lives with my parents. So it's been 30 years and all the kids have moved out and she still lives there. And the hope is at least she wants to die at home, which is very Cuban. Yeah. So, and anyway, so I grew up with like a grandma who is very Catholic and go to church every Sunday, and at the same time, like in private, was a santera. So like, and she definitely stopped practicing as I got older, but when I was little, I remember very vivid memories of her doing stuff with chickens that I don't understand to this day, and like doing spells and like doing divinations with cowrie shells, and she was very into it. And we've gone to botanicas to buy her like sangre, like full up sangre from like a chicken for a ritual when I was growing up. And she would just walk in there and she'd talk to people and she'd know everything about San Lázaro and Santa Barbara, which are basically like the synchronized versions of orishas, like, because Cuban magic and like Cuban culture, when you talk about Santeria, is a mix of Catholicism and you know, voodoo. So very interesting to grow up in that. And we had to keep that part of ourselves private, which is something I bring a lot to the show on Charmed, or I try to, is that like growing up Cuban American and growing up in between two cultural identities in Miami in the 90s, early 2000s, was that we couldn't be just Catholic or practice Santeria. You had to hide the Santeria part. So in the streets, we were Catholic. I did my first communion and my confirmation, and I was supposed to get married in Catholic church. And then, of course, my mom backed out. She really likes my atheist husband, and great mom. And then, why did you make me do my confirmation? That was horrible, but I understand. And then in private, we practice Santeria, but like very loosely, and we couldn't tell anybody about it. And when I was 16, I got in trouble for practicing witchcraft because I actually got into Wicca, because I thought it was cool. I was like, oh, it's like Santeria, but not really. And there's a female god and a male god, and there's a priest and a priestess, and it felt for me, very perfect. Like it was a blend of Catholicism with rituals and sacraments, but also a very modern and like female focused religion, which is something that like I really care about. So I was like, oh, I'll be a Wiccan. And then somebody from my school found out and told my Monsignor, and I got in trouble with the church. And that was crazy. And then my parents were like so upset because one, like in our community, in this very small, tight-knit, upper middle class community in Miami, I was not only like betraying that I was weird, and that my parents now, who have clients in this community and depend on our reputation within this community, and their persona, like that could be endangered. Our livelihood could have been endangered by me, because any other Cuban mom who heard, or any other Latin mom, honestly, because there's a lot of other different denominations of Latin people, if they heard that I practiced witchcraft, it was like dead silent. Like people just leave you. And so when I got in trouble with the church for Wicca, my parents were also really nervous that other people would find about the Santeria. So it was like there were stakes on this situation. We could lose something, our like money and our livelihood, and that freaked out me and made me feel really ashamed of who I was. So I've like really struggled with being in between identities and cultural, understandings of oneself. And I basically grew up in a really nice household where my parents were immigrants, did something that I think a lot of people dream of in America. They achieved the American dream. They started their own business, financial consulting, and lived in Kings Bay, which is now annexed to Coral Gables, and it was just middle class and sketchy. We had an ATF raid on our neighbor when I was really little for drug dealing in the 90s. Like, no big deal. My dad woke up and there was just like the FBI and the ATF on our door asking him questions, and we lived next to a power plant, and there was all this security, and it was always like a weird neighborhood to grow up in, but it was fun for a kid. It was great trick-or-treating, which I think is like the only hallmark a kid needs for a great neighborhood. I'm
curious to like what like Santeria and then your like witchcraft, like what does it look like, like what does it look like at home? How was it practiced, just because I'm not very well versed in all that.
No, for sure. So it really depends. Santeria is more of a divination based culture or religion, I would say. Yeah, definitely a religion. So for instance, like you have cowrie shells, which I don't know if you remember in Black Panther, like the scenes where they were doing like the big battle royales. Some of the actresses, like the main actresses, had these necklaces made of shells. And when I saw that, I almost cried. I was like, cowrie shells, like, because it is so African based from Yoruba, and like, I'm trying to think, there's a couple of other African denominations that I'm not totally recalling right now, but Yoruba is like the biggest one. And essentially, like, you throw these shells on a mat. A santera or a higher priestess or priest throws them on a mat, and there's different classifications with Santeria. The first one is like, I think it's just like a guardian or like a believer, and then you have to go through a whole process to be a santera, and then plus that. So, no one in my family really, I joke that someone sacrificed chickens, but like there were chickens involved. I never really saw anybody die, thank God. But I'd be like, something weird's going on in the garage. So I was never really sure, honestly. And I joke around at LA and my friends. I'm like, we did have chickens, and I loved them to death, and they would start disappearing when I was really young. And then I think because my parents were like, our daughter, I was the firstborn. I'm the firstborn. They were like, she's only 3. We can't keep having these chickens here. Was a way for us to kind of wean off of Santeria. And then essentially my grandma, she would dress in white on some occasions, but kind of she got older, got tired of it. And then we would just do divination. Like I said, like with cowrie shells, you throw them on a mat, and then whatever side is right side up or whatever side is right side down, you can basically infer from that pattern I forget the actual term for it, but it's basically like an oracle. You basically infer from the number of shells as they're facing up or down what your reading is. So like, and they're based on parables from the Orishas, like Obatala and Chango and like Luegua and like Yamoha, I think. Yameha? I always forget how to pronounce their name. Oh, damn. My grandma's going to kill me. But essentially, there are these gods, right? And in the stories of these gods are lessons. Very, very similar to the Bible. And when you put these shells down and you get a divination, you literally then read from them, okay, well, there's 4 right side up and 3 right side down. So that's 4-3. So that goes with this parable about this. So what are the gods trying to say within this parable for you? Very similar to tarot cards or something.
Yeah.
And my grandma did a lot of that. And so that was how I understood it. Was like, it was a fortune telling thing. I really stick by this. I never saw animal cruelty for the most part, I think. Even though according to the Supreme Court, you're allowed to sacrifice animals in the United States. I learned this in 1994 when my grandma like told me about it. And then I looked it up later as I got older. Yeah. That for religious reasons, as long as you eat the meat that you sacrifice at a feast or something, you're allowed to do it. But my family was still like, my grandma's really unique and wonky, but we never really did that. And then, you know, we just like had to keep it a secret because obviously people would find out and think we were crazy.
Yeah. And I'm curious, how much do you know about like life in Cuba, like for like your parents or your grandparents?
I know a little bit. My mom really got the brunt of it. She has told me some horror stories. She was born on July 24th, 1969, which is literally the day before the July 25th movement, in which Castro marched on to Havana. So my grandparents were in the hospital with their newborn baby girl, and they didn't have a name for her yet. And they looked outside their window, you know, the next day after giving birth, and there's Castro marching on to the hospital, basically, or right past it. So my mom grew up as a young girl, you know, trying to live her life. She grew up middle class and had farmers in their extended family and stuff. So like lower to middle class. And she doesn't remember a ton from that period, but she has horror stories of my grandma, her mom, being arrested for wearing black to a funeral because at the time you could only wear fatigues. And everyone was called into the communist government to call to action. So you would have to work on different labor camps or agricultural camps. And my grandfather disappeared for 2 years and then came home and was completely different. He was taken to be in an agriculture camp and was forced to. I don't know if he was kidnapped or if he was just, they came to your door and said, you're coming right now. But they didn't see him for 2 years. And so my grandma was on her own trying to make ends meet and running, I think they had a small shop or something, but I forget what they did for work. But my mom, you know, had to learn all the Castro marches and anthems and speeches in school. And her mom, when she would get home, would rip up her books. Like, we're not doing this. But they had no choice. And there are some things my mom has alluded to that I'm not totally confirmed on. For instance, her cousin dying in a firing squad, like really horrible things. So when I told my mom I wanted to study abroad in Cuba if I went to NYU, I've never seen her more angry in my life. Like, I've seen my mom angry, as we all have, but she was so hysterical and was in the kitchen cooking that pots were flying. And my dad was like, get out of the kitchen. Like, everyone get out, and scurried out. And we had to close the door so my mom could vent. And my dad's like, don't ever say that to your mother again. And then later that day, my mom took me inside and said, you cannot go to Cuba until I'm dead. And I said, okay, Mom, I promise you that. And then so my dad came over and I heard my parents, his side of the story from my grandparents, but they were much more bourgeoisie and upper class. And they actually had friends who knew Batista, the previous dictator to Castro. And that's why they had to be smuggled out because they were in so much danger for being affiliated to Batista, I think. And then my mom was just a regular person and she came over as a freedom fighter. She didn't take a boat, she took a plane. And they came here because they had asylum. They had friends and family living in Miami. And as a result, they ended up just, you know, chilling around Florida, living different parts of South Florida until my parents married. And what can you, like, I'm always, because it's like, I'm not too familiar with like the Cuban experience, especially like the Miami, South Florida experience. That's very different.
So I would like to know just your experience of it, of just like, what was your household like the culture, you know?
Yeah. So So because my parents were able to lift themselves out of poverty before I was born, running their own business, we lived in a predominantly Jewish and American neighborhoods for most of my life. I don't know how much you know about Florida or South Florida, but it's a very eclectic mix of unique racism and unique culture. So for instance, growing up until I was about high school age, so 15, all my friends were white or black, and I didn't know any Asians or any Asian, like Indian, anything like that, because they just weren't in Miami. And so like my first crush was like this really cute black boy named Tyler. And then and then my lifelong dream was to be with Daniel Smith, who's like the southernest Southern you've ever met. And it's crazy. So in Florida, you know, predominantly Florida is very white, and we still have a form of sharecropping in Central Florida. And then you get to South Florida, and everyone calls it North Cuba because there are so many Cubans. And then when I was in high school, because of the situation with, I think his name was Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, a huge influx of Venezuelans came, and then followed by Colombians and Argentinians. And so my whole high school was Latin American, and we taught some classes were in Spanish. Like, it was just the way it was. And so I grew up with you know, a diverse preschool, but was mostly white. Lower school was like mostly white. And then middle school, all of a sudden, all these Jewish kids came from their temples when they were going to elementary school. So I was like, oh, Passover, this is cool. This is new about mitzvahs. Okay, let's party. And then high school came, and that's when identity really hit me, where I was like, oh, I'm not Latin enough to be around these kids.
Yeah, and that's always something I like to cover, like the high school years. Like I ask people, like, who were you? Who were you pretending to be?
That's a great question.
And how did people see you?
Oh man, the trauma of my life. It was really rough. Because freshman year you walk in and you speak Spanish, and kids are telling you, oh, your Spanish is horrible. Oh, you were such a gringa. Oh, like, and I hated myself, like truly hated myself for not being Spanish enough, because my parents spoke Spanish fluently. My grandma spoke Spanish fluently. I was studied abroad in Spain in high school. I was great in Spain. I had a great time. And I like got by, and like all these boys liked me, and they thought my Spanish was great. And then I come back to Miami, and I'm still not good enough. Yeah. So I'll blend the two, but essentially like my family is very tight knit. Just to kind of go back to your previous question and answer this one. My parents didn't have a ton of adult friends, so they were always with us. And my grandma moved in the day after I was born. She sold her house, said, here I am, and she never left for 30 years. Yeah. She's still there with my parents, and she took care of us, and we never had a nanny. Like, my mom was like, a nanny? Who does that? White people do that. Yeah. Cubans don't do that. Miami people, a lot of my friends who were from Venezuela, or you know, that was predominant, but other countries, they had live-in nannies and live-in housekeepers from those countries, as if they were indentured servitudes. So that was always crazy to me. I'd go to my friend's house, and her dad was like, or grandpa was like loaded, and he had his own quarters for his housekeepers, their own house. I was like, oh my God, like, that sounds awesome. Why doesn't my grandma have her own house? Because that would get her out of my hair. So they're very constricting, and my parents are very immigrants, so they don't trust anybody. So I then, growing up, didn't have a ton of friends, because my parents would literally go through and, like, you know, analyze their parents, not just what they do or where they live, but like, what do they believe in? What's their religion? And you're like, this is not healthy. Even as a kid, I was like, this is unfair. So growing up, ever since I was a small kid, I went to the same private school, partly against my will. My parents had come up through segregation in the Florida school system, and some in Chicago for my dad, who lived there for a while. And my parents, I don't know how much you know about Florida history, but we were one of the last states to integrate our schools. So my parents were right on the cusp of integration, and they went through integration. And my dad was like, these Florida schools are predominantly horrible, not just education, but safety. And we keep cutting educational money in Florida, and it's just not obviously working out. So my parents were like, we're never going to send you to public school, no matter how much you want to go. So we're going to send you to private school, which was fine for the first few years when you're small. But then as you get older, these kids who knew you from 4th grade, where you were called a loser to your face, then as you grow up, stays with you. So there's like a whole new level of trauma where you can't escape an identity that you don't believe belongs to you. Yeah. Especially as a Cuban American, where as new ethnicities and cultures came into my school of 15 years, I thought, I could redefine myself, but the old label would find their way to them because it was very small. Yeah. And especially since my Spanish wasn't 110%, I would get picked on mercilessly. So I feel like I was bullied before cyberbullying was cool, because I definitely got cyberbullied. There were people that wrote plays about me and like short stories about how terrible, like I was a slut. And I'm not going to lie, I was very sexually independent back in high school, but it was more of like a power thing for me. Yeah. And it was something I didn't want my parents to tell me what to do with my body, which is still something they do today. And so it was really rough. So high school, I was a self-titled loser. For a long time, I believed I was a loser. And so I would write plays and watch films and do things to try and get out of that mindset, to escape. And then I would start winning these awards for playwriting because I actually gave a shit about the craft, and people started to take notice. But I still was not invited to the cool parties. Like, I didn't go to Nikki Beach. I was not going to South Beach and clubbing. Like, I really wanted to. And when I went to college, everyone was like, "Oh, you're from Miami. Did you do Blow? Did you go to 11? Did you go to Fountainblue Live's a club that's really famous?" And I was like, no. I was locked in my house. My parents also had an alarm system. They still do. That they never told me the code to, like, on purpose. Yeah. Because and I realized in college it wasn't to keep the crazies out or the rapists, which my mom would always say, like, we had a gate, we have motion, we have like a full fortress at my house. And my parents being immigrants and have gone through a lot, been robbed from, and people broken into their house and almost raped my aunt, like horrible things, and agricultural camps. They are very scared of the outside world and love their bubble. But then I realized the alarm system was to keep me and my sisters in to a certain degree, because they turn it on and I would try to sneak out or something, and they were not happy. Yeah. And I was like, why can't I sneak out? Why can't I have an American existence like John Hughes has in his movies? Yeah. That does seem really cool. Or living in Chicago in a suburb. That seems really cool, Mom. And they were not down for any of that. Yeah. So it was weird.
Yeah, and you sort of just like transition to like the next part I like to hear about. It's like, so where did like the writing come in for you, like the seed of it in high school, and like how did you know that was something you wanted to try and then like were succeeding at?
So actually, it was way before high school. I wanted to be a writer since I was 4 years old, which I know is really young and probably really crystallized when I was about 8 or 10. Mm-hmm. But essentially, when I was 4 and younger, my mom would read to me every night. She just loves reading, and she has like the coolest children's books, like Froggy, You Forgot Your Pants, or like The Big Bear and the Big Red Strawberry, that are just like really fun picture books for kids. And she would read them to my sisters and I every night, which is like, I cannot thank my mom enough. And I just loved them. I was like, this is cool. Like, this is awesome. But also my mom would cry reading certain books, and I would remember thinking very early on, like, this book has a lot of power to influence someone's emotions. Yeah. It was like I Love You Forever, like one of the saddest books of all time. My mom's like crying, and I'm like, what's wrong, Mom? You're gonna live forever.
Yeah, like, we had the Spanish version.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And my mom would read Spanish books too. My first book I ever read in Spanish was Pali tiene los chickenpox. It was like a Spanglish book. It wasn't even full Spanish. That was the first book I read in kindergarten for my first book reading assignment. Mm-hmm. And essentially, I would go to her with, computer paper or printer paper, and I would fold it hamburger style and staple it like a book and draw inside and be like, Mom, this is a story of us going to the grocery store. Yeah. And she kind of knew that I had a knack for it, so she really pushed me as I got older to submit to competitions and like do stuff in class for extra credit for stories. And I would start winning all these awards. And when I was 10, I wrote a rip-off story of Kiki's Delivery Service, but with a Cuban bruja. Cool. Because I was like, this is a cool story. I would
watch that now.
Yeah, it would be cool. And I love that movie. As a kid, I was like, I need to be Kiki. Yeah. I need to be a witch who flies over the world and has freedom. Yeah. Because I had no freedom as a kid. And I think that's what made me better storytellers. When you have no friends and your family's very constricting and you have a big backyard growing up and dogs, and like we just were always outside constantly. I'm a gardener. I used to garden as a kid. Like I'm very extroverted, but I didn't really have friends. So I would be always like out and about in the backyard making up stories. Yeah. I became really good at being on the swing set, and my poor parents, I talk to myself a lot. It's called walking daydreaming. It's a symptom of trauma. And I started really walking daydreaming when I was a little kid to avoid, the issues at home. And as a result, I'd be on the swing set for hours. I would get welts on my butt and my hips because I'd just be sitting there going back and forth. And it's very melodic. Meditative. And you're going up and down, and I would just talk to myself, creating stories constantly. Mm-hmm. And I would write them down when I got inside, and then I'd put some cream on my butt because it hurts so much. And essentially, as I got older, I would take these stories. And when I was 10, I won a huge award in my school for writing a short story at a fourth grade level based on Kiki's Delivery Service of a Cuban witch. And then my mom was like, oh, my God, you're a writer. Like, my mom knew. And I was like, Mom, I don't know. And I was really scared. I was like, Mom, I don't know if I could be a writer. My parents really wanted me to be a doctor or lawyer, very Cuban immigrant. Like, you're going to be poor if you be an artist. Like, we didn't come to America and sacrifice everything and go through so much trauma for you to be a writer. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
It was like a dishonor to the family. So essentially, I decided to keep writing in secret. I always had journals. And then my mom and dad bought me a dollhouse around that same time when I was 10, and I went crazy. I still have the dollhouse, and so I built a town out of dolls, like tiny little dolls you get out of Burger King or McDonald's. Yeah. I had a house of Little Mermaid. I had a house of Cinderella. I had a house of Sleeping Beauty because they were being re-released on VHS, so they were all in Happy Meals. And then we went to Toys R Us, and my grandma, if I was good and got a good report card, would let me get a new tiny doll for the dollhouse. I got a little dog one time. And I built a town. It was called Our Town. And I built on the floor a map where all the homes go. And so there's a post office and a grocery store. Mm-hmm. And my parents would walk in, and I would have different voices for each of the characters. Yeah. And the main character was named Maggie. And she was in an abusive household. And she was just trying to solve a murder in her town. And I was 10. Yeah. And my mom would walk in and be like, either you're going to be a real estate developer or you're going to be a writer. There's no other way. And my dad would walk in, and he would be mad. And, he would let me play. But he's like, this is scaring me. Like, you have something going on here. So I got tested for schizophrenia when I was really young. And they were worried. They were like, you don't have a lot of friends. You just want to hang out with your dolls. I did that for about 3 years. And then puberty hits and you go, oh, crap. I like boys now or girls, whatever floats your boat. And I just kept writing. And then when I was 13, I wrote a play about my family for just like a drama competition. And I won the highest award in the district, Critics' Choice. So then I was bit. I was like, all right, I was teetering on wanting to be a writer, but now I'm fully into this because there's an actual result I can show my parents and be like, please let me out of this contract, this non-existent contract of like being a doctor. Long story short, throughout high school, I wrote more and I won a couple more awards. But the one play that so there's a thing called it's like student directing or student writing. But the category of writing, I wrote a separate play. And then that year when I was like 15 in high school or 14 in middle school, I directed a scene from All Real Women Have Curves. And that won Critics' Choice at both state and district. They were so amazed that I don't know, not they were amazed, but they were impressed enough to give me the award. But I was like this small Cuban girl who took a play about Latin women and really made it my own. Just this one scene. And I remember my drama teacher was blown away. He was like, you have a knack for storytelling and like directing and characters and emotion that like most kids your age don't have. And I went on to states and won more there. And at that point I was like fully in. I was like, oh, I'm high on this. This is the new drug. Yeah. And I was also doing my confirmation, and so I started to think to myself that God wanted me to be a writer and that this was my destiny. It was like a calling almost. A calling I've had since I was so young that I didn't really compute, and now it was all crystallizing. Yeah. So by the time I was 16, I wrote a one-act play about a Cuban Nancy Drew. You see a theme here. Yeah. Crime and Cubanism, and and I ended up winning second place in the nation at the Scholastic Songwriting Awards. Cool. And at that point, I was like, oh, we in this, boo. Yeah. And at that point, my father freaked out and was like, you're not doing this anymore. So I applied to USC screenwriting program and NYU screenwriting program in secret. My father actually caught me in the middle of the night. He literally like a ghost walked in at 3 a.m. and scared the bejesus out of me. Yeah. And I was in the middle of my USC application. It was on my screen on my laptop. He walks over immediately. What are you doing, Chi-Chi? Why are you up at 3 a.m? Opens the door, freaks me out, walks in, looks at the screen, he's like, what are you doing? I had betrayed him on a deeper level. Yeah. And he said, if you even get into the school, I won't let you go because you're going to be a Democrat, which I already was, dog. He just didn't want to accept it at the time. I was already a Democrat since I was 14.
His worst fear.
His worst fears. Because there's a saying in Miami that your dad wants you to marry someone with the 3 C's: Cuban, Catholic, conservative. And my husband is obviously atheist, Democrat, liberal. He is not the 3 C's at all. Yeah. And I was that way too. I was not going to follow the 3 C's. But by then I was like, Dad, God wants me to be a writer. I want to make a difference in the world. This is my calling. And he was like, calling schmalling. You need money, honey. It doesn't matter what you want to do with your life. Yeah. I ended up getting into both schools. And over 2,000 kids applied to each program, and they only accept 20 or 14. And I got into both classes. And at that point, my dad was freaking out because he was like, oh crap, you're talented. I already knew that. You obviously want to do this. You're driven. Oh, fuck. He had to he was freaking out. And my mom was secretly excited. She was like, yes, Chi-Chi, go to Hollywood. Yeah. Go get in the Emmys. Let me go with you. My mom reads People magazine almost every
funny.
day. She's awesome. She loves celebrities. And then I got into both schools, and long story short, I wrote about my family for each essay, and Napoleon Dynamite, one of my favorite films of all time, and how that movie changed my life. I got in, and only USC offered financial aid, so I went to USC. And I've never looked back on my identity as a writer, but there were times in this industry, as I'm sure we'll get into, where you spend 6 years as an assistant, and you want to be a writer so bad, and no one else cares about that. So you have to keep... Like my parents, I always say this, I've gotten a lot of good practice in proving that I'm worth someone's attention, or proving that I'm a writer, and proving that I can be in between cultures and still be Latin and still be American. Not a great headspace to be in, but
I'm curious about what your experience was like, moving to LA just in general.
It's terrifying.
And then just your experience while you were at USC.
So moving to LA, I was in culture shock for about a year. I didn't know what a hipster was when I moved here. Like, I didn't understand. And I love the beatniks, and I love, like, beatnik culture. That is something I read exclusively in high school my last year when I really decided to do film over theater. It was like so I spent a year deciding to do film over theater because I was starting to watch more movies and really saw the power of movies more than theater at the time. / also you could make a little bit of a better living. And that was a selling point to my parents. And then I finally get to film school, and I'm like, I've made it. I'm a real writer now. And you're in classes with people from all different walks of life who are much better than you because they've gotten a little bit of a head start. Their parents were supportive. And I was crushed. I was like, I'm not good enough to be here. The first day I walked into school, we had like one-on-one meetings with our advisor, and I went in crying because I was like, I don't know if I could do this. I don't think I'm good enough to be here. I have imposter syndrome. And the other side of that was I walk onto USC's campus. Everyone's predominantly white. It's a very fratty culture. But also the people that were Spanish were mostly Chicano in the central. Is it central Chicano? Yeah. And I went to one of their meetings, like, welcome all new students. And I sat there and I felt this immense imposter syndrome because I'm not Chicana at all.
Yeah.
So I was like, is there another Latin club? But there's only one, really, that has any real prevalence on the scene. So I felt really out of place. So I was like, okay, I'll lean more into my American side, like, fine. And I started hanging out these quote-unquote self-proclaimed hipsters, and they're really mean to me because they're all from Pacific Palisades and Encino, and they're all like a very, unique breed of LA that I was not familiar with. And I would try to speak Spanish with them, and they didn't speak a lick of Spanish, and they were just mean. And I felt like I was back in high school. So I just started making friends with film people, and I found that my Latinness and Cubanness was exotic to some men, especially, which was interesting. Like, oh, I've never had a Cuban woman before. Oh, sure, babe, let's go. Like, I guess. It was actually fun, and I got something out of it. But at the same time, I didn't feel like I belonged for a good part. It wasn't until junior year when I fell into a film fraternity called Delta Kappa Alpha that changed my life and made me feel like I belonged with a group of people. And I would call my mom and tell her I've never been this happy in my life. And I suffer from intense anxiety and depression sometimes. So my mom was thrilled. Having a year before been like, I'm going to kill myself, to I'm very happy, I'm never going to be unhappy again, was a huge contrast. But it was a really hard adjustment because, as I'm sure you know, when you walk around LA and you speak to someone in Spanish, they always respond in English. And in Miami, you don't do that, honey. You won't get service. You won't get food. You won't get your cafecito. Like, people find it rude and offensive. In LA, that's not the case. In LA, they respond in English, and you respond back in English after you start in Spanish. And it's when I first encountered that, I was like, why is this person being so rude to me? And I had a couple friends who are Chicano, and they told me, hey, like, in LA, it's different for us. Like, there's an east side of LA, which is where we're from, or some of our family, and some are from San Gabriel Valley and wherever, all over the place. But you hear people responding English because they don't know if you're an ICE agent. They don't know anything about you. And I'm like, but I'm clearly Hispanic, and like my skin color and how I pronounce words, and I'm not coming to you with an agenda, but I understand why other people are cautious. In Miami, we don't really have ICE. I mean, we do, but like, everyone is Hispanic, so there's like no way around it. It's a very different culture, and you're proud to be Hispanic there. There's only one way to live, and that's 100% loud and proud Latin. And when I came here, it was like I had to hide a big part of myself to fit in, to belong. So it was the opposite. Whereas I was trying for so many years in Miami to be more Latin, now I had to be more American. And when I met my husband, as we were dating, he knew I was Cuban. I always tell people the moment you meet me, I'm like, oh, I'm Cuban American, honey. Like, I respect where I am and who I am.
Yeah.
He thought I was white. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, you're kind of white passing. And that shattered my whole world because I have never identified that way, nor do I ever want to.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, so you're saying I'm going to get benefits because of my skin color that I didn't know were real.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, obviously. And that, I was like, okay, I don't think we should be exclusive. I don't think we should talk to each other anymore. And then he grew on me and I grew on him and now we're married. But there was a lot of moments that he just really awoke me to the fact that I was in a different position.
Yeah, because it's interesting, just like, because, I was born in Mexico, grew up in Chicago. And now I'm in LA, and when I go to East LA, when I was doing theater there and I do events there now, I do come a little bit in as an outsider just because there's like a different experience, but it's also like I've been in Boyle Heights and someone's like been like, oh yeah, they're white, and then they point to me like you, and I'm just like, oh, like it is a shock to the system just because it's like, your story, your identity, where you come from, but it sort of speaks again to like that question of like, with Latinx identity, it's like, how do you see yourself, your Latinxness? How do other people see it? Yeah. And also, how do you present it in a way that's like, and by how do you present it, it's like, can be twofold in the way that like present it to other Latinx folk, but also how you want it perceived by white people. And like, but it's tricky because it's like, I think I was, we were, my family was like, we were like undocumented growing up. So I was aware that I was like ethnically ambiguous to people. And that served us because we could hide in that,
Totally.
But even now, like I was talking to someone on the podcast, like I know I read as intern, I read as student, in a way that other people don't. Yeah. And they get a different sort of like reaction, behavior, connotation just on how they present. Totally. Which again, doesn't have to do anything with how they feel on the inside. Yeah. But it is tricky how like we will also do it to each other. We will police each other, like.
Yeah, it's rough.
Because again, I think we're coming from our idea of what like Latinxness is. Yeah. And then when it does it, other people don't fall into it. It's like there can be some judgment. There can be some like otherness.
For sure. I've never experienced racism, like intercultural racism, than when I did in Miami. LA is very stark Americanism, but in Miami, the racism there is very unique. For instance, I had a teacher in a history class who I adore to so many degrees for his intelligence and crazy. And just the way he taught, but he would say things because he was Peruvian, and he would be like, oh, those Cuban girls. Like, I'm 15, I'm 16. He's definitely not hitting on me. He was married, but he had a Cuban wife, and he would say things like, oh, those Cuban girls, man, they're just so beautiful. But Dominican girls, oh, disgusting. Like, oh my God. And I knew back then what the connotation was. They were darker. Yeah. And I had friends who were white Mexican. One of my best friends is Germanic or Swedish Mexican. Meaning her parents were obviously German or Swedish many generations before they moved to Mexico, and had been there for years. And when she went to her college and joined the Latin committee group there, student organization, they told her that they were happy to have her, but they didn't want her to bring her friend, who was her roommate at the time, who was from Chile, who was darker. And they said because they only allowed white Hispanics in the group, which like blew her mind. And she was like, well, then I have no reason to be part of your group because that's not how I identify. She always identified as Mexican first, then a white person. Yeah. I was identified as Cuban first and then American for a long, long time until I moved to LA. Now it's a little flipped, but even begrudgingly so. But essentially, like, I had so many friends who were like, don't talk to this girl, she's Argentinian. I was like, but you're from Colombia. Like, you're basically near each other. Yeah. And, Brazilians, like, it was crazy. And then I had a lot of friends who didn't care. They were all Cuban and Colombian, and they were all mixed, and they were all beautiful, and they all embraced each other. So it was like a really unique racism that I still find prevalent. Yeah. And it drives me nuts because I'm like, guys, now that you're in America, we're all kind of like grouped together on the census form. So we're kind of screwed. Yeah. So we need to hang out together.
Yeah. And it just, it's complicated because, just the Latinx identity, especially in America, is just like so relative to like whiteness. Yeah. And it's not even its own little bubble where it's concentrated. It's such a reaction to like how we're seen, how we want other people to see us, how like how, oh, I'm not like them, I'm like you.
Exactly, because
So-
it's all about belonging and having this feeling of belonging.
And coming in as immigrants, trying to assimilate, trying to be American in a way that's based in whiteness.
But even as a millennial, like, you don't want to simulate totally, right?
No.
Like, you want to have your own identity now.
And I think a friend of mine was explaining this to me because, you know, he was just saying, like, we need to reframe our sense of, like, what American is. I think the go-to and just how it's perceived in the media, it's very white. Mm-hmm. And it's like America's like, or the U.S. is a very multicultural country. So that's how we should be framing the American sense of just like, your name could be anything, your skin color could be anything. Yeah. And we need to like, sort of like, because that is the reality of it.
Exactly. And you're more of a mystery than a concrete fact almost. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's still something we have to unlearn just because it's like, you have to fit in, but it's like, what are we fitting into? Like, let's.
Yeah.
And you don't even think that far because you're just like, well, I want to be American. You know? It's
I just want to have friends.
It's an easy trap to fall into.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? So I did want to ask about like after you graduated from USC, like. Mm-hmm. Like, did you have a plan? Did it go according to plan? What happened?
It all blew up in my face.
Just because, you know, you're in college, you're like, I'm going to be a writer. Like, and they don't really prepare you for what happens after that.
I will say, to USC's film school's credit, just the film school, it is a very pre-professional school, meaning they really do prepare you for after as much as they can. Yeah. I mean, they give a lot of opportunities. I feel like the friends of mine who are like, oh, USC's School of Cinematic Arts, we call it SCA, didn't prepare me at all. And I'm like, well, did you go to this meeting? Did you go to this talk? Did you go to this panel? Yeah. I mean, my thing, I've always been really driven and ambitious. I'm House Slytherin, even though I'm also ashamed about that because of all the connotations House Slytherin has. Hilarious. But I've taken many tests and I'm still House Slytherin. So I'm very like ambitious and driven, and I was not going to just sit there and let success come to me because, of course, my parents, they went through a lot of trauma and went through a lot of hardship before they made the money they made and got us out of poverty as a family. And so we were the only people in our family actually who had money. And long story short, when we would have Gahachina Day, Noche Buena, we have Christmas Eve, and we would do a Gahachina, which is like a pig in a box. and it's a big thing in Miami. Actually, this year, my mom told me the CDC proclaimed that there was an influx of swine flu because so many people eat pig around New Year's Eve and Christmas that people got swine flu.
Interesting.
It's crazy. It's like so weird. I'm like, of course we got swine flu. You have to get your pig like months in advance. Yeah. It's a big ritual. It takes days to season and cook and all the stuff. And it's awesome. I love Gahachina so much. It's so delicious. And it's also just like you get drunk all day. And it's just fun. But essentially, my I forgot what I was even talking about. But yeah, so essentially at USC, like, I knew that if I was going to be a writer, and I really wanted to be a writer, even though a lot of days I doubted that too, because you're surrounded by people who are better writers than you. You're like, my parents worked so hard to be where they are. It's maybe success is in our blood. Maybe it's not. Every parent before my parents, so my dad's side of the family, each of them were successful. They had businesses in Cuba, or they were real estate agents, or they owned property. And my dad always believed in himself so much that, and he's, my dad, he's big machismo narcissist, that he was like, well, I'm gonna make it even if it's America. And he did. He saw himself in limousines when he was 8, and that was his destiny and his calling. And so he did that and got very fortunate and worked hard with my mom, and they worked together as partners, and she was like his secretary, and she actually has a secretarial degree that does not exist anymore from the 70s or 80s. Cool. Crazy. Super old school. And my parents, I was like, if I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to work really hard, and I'm going to get a job in the industry, and I'm going to be an assistant, and then I'm going to be a writer, and that's my plan. And then, of course, I went to Bonnaroo. I went on a big road trip, did, drugs, did the post-college thing. I was like, I only have one shot to be young. And then I came back and just applied to jobs and finally got one working at a boutique management company. And that was a wake-up call to how hard this really was going to be. And I had a come-to-Jesus moment, many couple Jesus moments in traffic in LA, where I was like, oh, this is maybe not for me. Maybe I should go to law school and listen to my parents. But it was more, it would take a couple of years to get to that point. I did a lot of assistant jobs. I started at a company called Sentient Entertainment. Then I went to Creative Artists Agency, and I worked there as a floater for 7 months, which I really loved being a floater. You get to be in all the different departments and make all these different friends and go to the Roosevelt and do blow and have fun and be young and be 24 and be like, I'm hot. And then it was so much fun. And then I was in TV lit for about a year working for an agent called Bruce Finneker, who's a much older agent, second oldest person at the company, one of the first original employees of the company. So he was part of a book interview series when I was with him, and he runs helping to run the Walking Dead lawsuit. Like, he's in a bunch of really cool stuff, and he mostly reps novelists. So I learned a ton there about contracts and law and like how to be a writer on the business side and what the business really was, because when you work in an agency, you're in the middle of the ecosystem that is the entertainment industry. And so I was like, okay, I'll be an assistant here, I'll be an assistant there, I'll get staplers thrown at my head. Just duck, Chrissy, just duck. I got vomited on at one point. I was like, I had an ulcer, went to the hospital. I was not taking care of myself from the stress of these jobs.
Yeah.
Then I went to Imagine Television, where it was really fun, and we had shows like Empire and Shots Fired and 24 Legacy on the air, and we were selling and developing and becoming a studio. And within 1 week of being there, I realized I did not like development. I hated it. The only reason I worked in development was because a couple things. I started in management just because I needed a job.
Yeah.
You need to get your teeth cut. Cool. Really got my teeth cut on that one. Went to CAA because at the time I was working in management and features and not television, very limited television, and I knew I wanted to do television. But I also made a lot of assistant friends in networking and realized that if I stayed on the feature side, even just to get to another job at development or something, I was never going to end up in TV where I needed to be.
Yeah.
So the only way to do that is to kind of start over. So I went to an agency, and I had a friend who'd worked there, and she's like, if you're going to work at an agency, you need to work at a top agency that has a lot of clout. So you can because anytime you work an agency like this for a year, you have like a bona fide thing on your resume that tells people this girl can take abuse.
Yeah.
So like, really fun fact of this town. I then went to CAA and got into TV Lit. I waited 7 months. I finally got in. And I was so happy to be there. I even wanted to be an agent for a second because I was like, this place is intoxicating. Like, you know everything before it happens. You know all the secrets. You know all the rumors. You know all the lies. Like, there's a huge degree of power in being an agent. But very quickly, I realized that lifestyle was not for me because you're never off. You're always on.
Yeah.
And it's very taxing. And I had a boyfriend at the time / now husband that was just not conducive for us. I like being with him. So I want to hang out with him and have a family. And the hours are terrible. Really terrible. So I was like, okay, screw being an agent. And as I was looking for a job on a TV show, my old boss, who's a much older man, was like, hey, if you don't want to be an agent or like, you know, be here in TV Lit, because I already started looking for jobs, he was like, you have to be a floater and get off my desk, which was really scary because that basically means getting demoted, and I wouldn't have access to the same opportunities that for job listings if I had just stayed in TV Lit. So I had to look quickly for a job, and I had a lot of friends be like, if you go into development, you can, if they sell something, you can get on one of their shows. It's like a fast track way. So I go into development, and I thought maybe I'll be a development exec. Like, I actually like development. You read a bunch and then you make things happen. And I learned very quickly that development is not exactly like that, and there's a lot of politics, and I just realized I didn't like reading that much. I liked writing my own stuff that other people could read. And just in a week, I knew, I was like, oh man, this is bad. I made a mistake. I should have tried to go for a room. And then Donald Trump became president, which like was just a whiplash effect. And my husband proposed to me. And the day he proposed to me, I said yes. And this was around like end of 2016, right? 2016 and to 2017. And the day he proposed to me, I took him aside and said, babe, I have something to tell you. He's like, what? You're cheating on me. You don't want to get married. Like all the things. Yeah. He's panicking. And we're like, no. I want to quit my job and be unemployed for a while and write and be a writer. Because if Donald Trump's presidency really rocked me to my core for so many reasons. Not just the immigration ban at the time or the Women's March, like all these things that happened around the time I quit, but the fact that he even became president and the country was not the country that I was led to believe was my country for so many years, and the country that I had invested in. I was part of Occupy Wall Street and went downtown and lived in tents with my boyfriend and took part in protests and like, sorry, I went off the question, but essentially I worked really hard and got staplers done at me and got people vomited on me. And then I was unemployed, and I was able to get unemployment insurance from my previous employer at Imagine. And I quit to be a writer and realized I had kind of taken a sidestep by going into development. I'm glad I did, because I learned a ton about development for writers and how that process works, which is a very unique process and a little cutthroat. Essentially, I learned a lot, and I decided to be unemployed, and I started writing again consistently. I had been writing on and off ever since I graduated, but I graduated with 3 features, a spec, and a pilot. And I had a lot of material, and I had met with managers and stuff, but they were like, you're too young. Come back to us when you've had life experience. And the only life experience I was able to get, because I had to feed myself, was working in the industry, which honestly, from a mental health standpoint, was a lot of good experience. I was in therapy all the time. I started taking antidepressants because of the nature of my jobs and my own mental health issues in college. And then my jobs escalated all of that, and I really took care of myself. And I'm proud to say that I feel much better. And with it. But eventually I interviewed because of my resume, because I'd worked at CA. I took 16 showrunner assistant jobs, and I got 3 offers. And the one offer I held out for that I really wanted and I'm glad I took was working for Courtney Kemp as her assistant in LA for Power. And I did that for 2 years. And it was the first time I worked at a job where literally the writer's room and some people in post, and everyone was diverse for the most part. And it was the first time I was in a room with only people who were brown or black. And that was really awesome. Yeah. But in the meantime, I had applied to the fellowships just because, like, why not? Yeah. And you need a backup. And I got into the CBS Writers Program, and through that was able to be staffed on Charmed, which is CW TV Studios production. And when I left Courtney, we were both very sad. I was like, oh no. Because she has, like, I'm sure you've read the news, but they have a bunch of spinoffs of the show.
the universe, the Power universe.
Universe, yeah. So I was there for that. So I've been very fortunate. Yeah,
and, just real quick, what was, like, the CBS fellowship like, just for, like, the audience at home?
For sure. It's actually an amazing program, and I highly recommend it to anyone. I think it's the best program out of all the diversity ones. I know Disney pays you, but they pay you $50,000, and then you staff you, and then you don't really get that much money after that. So I would check the fine print. CBS, I think, has the highest staffing retention rate, meaning you get staffed and then you get asked back on the shows. So the program is less a writing program as it is more of a professional program where they teach you how to sell yourself.
Got it.
Like I have they call it your personal nuggets, little stories of yourself that inform meetings or writing or anything you can do to sell yourself on social media. And then they also have something called the personal A story or your personal story, which is like a 3-sentence logline of who you are.
Got it.
And mine is like really nerdy.
I mean, they're all nerdy.
Yeah, because it's like being a robot. This is who I am. So, but the program was amazing because it actually, there were certain stories I didn't want to tell because they're too traumatic or too weird. And I went for it. I was told by other people who had gone through the program, the only way you're going to succeed in this business as a writer is you have to kind of put your trauma up for sale, which is not the best way to put it, but it's kind of true.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely.
So one of my first nuggets I talked about was the whole situation when I was 16 and getting caught for Wicca and all that stuff. And my instructor was like, Chrissy, people are going to think you're weird. Don't use that story. I was like, but you said to go for it. And so I have learned that these stories that are really hard to tell, like I will get emotional sometimes, like in the writer's room on Charmed, I get a little emotional, but there's stories that have to be told and that people may find relatable or may find them too weird, but understand the universal theme behind them. Yeah. So, the program's amazing.
And so what has been your experience on Charmed? Because it's like, if you, just by listening to the interview, it's like, it was maybe like something you were always like headed to,
I mean, it feels destined, but it also, like, trust me, if you had asked me 4 years ago, I would have been like, what? You're lying. Yeah. Because I think when you're in the thick of trying to break in, and especially if you've been a Hollywood assistant who has taken a lot of different types of abuse and really bad days and hospital stays because of those bad days, you kind of don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. A lot of my friends are still assistants, and some of them really do see the light. They have managers on the cusp of being staffed or developing, and I have other friends who have just not been that fortunate or, have learned to hustle harder as a result because it is so competitive. So I would say Charmed, is amazing. I'm obsessed with the show. I'm obsessed with the show every day. I go in every day. I'm really excited to be there. The room is amazing. It's a big room because it's broadcast, so there's 14 people. We have people from all different walks of life. It's mostly female, which is uncommon in most rooms. Yeah. And there's 2 moms who each gave birth during the season, and a guy friend of mine, a male writer who had a baby too. So we're a very family friendly room, and people bring their babies, and I'm like, oh, thank God, thank you. My ovaries need this. And very just mentoring, which I find is not the norm in the industry because people are busy and they don't have time to mentor all the time. Yeah. They kind of can do stuff here and there, but they're really busy and they're kind of consumed with what's in front of them. And so really when people say, well, this person didn't mentor me and they said they would, I'm like, well, that's very Hollywood of them. But two, like the best way to learn in this business is by osmosis and just being in the trenches. So now if you had asked me again like 2 years ago, I've been like, what's staffing? But the program changed my life and I owe everything to it.
And is there like any like experience you had on Charmed, you know, just from like how you grew up, from your grandmother, from like that you were like, this is something I'm able to impart into it, or something that you were just proud of or like happy to like.
I'm the main bruja, like witchy lady on staff. I wouldn't say I'm the only witch on staff, but I am the one that brings the witch presence to the room, given my background, my grandma being a santera, but also Wicca. And I like, because of being on this show, I've really delved into Wicca more. So I bought a lot more books and spell books and making my own spells. And I haven't practiced any rituals as of 2020, but in 2019, like I did something for Yule, which is around Christmas. And that was really important to me. And so the show has personally affected me spiritually and made me realize that I have a crisis of spirituality. I don't go to Catholic church ever since I was confirmed. And because that confirmation is crazy. They just put a bunch of oil on your head in the shape of a cross and you break out in the cross formation for the next 2 weeks. It's not ideal for any teenager. But okay. And I have a lot of friends who are very in touch with their spirituality, especially Christian friends in LA. Mm-hmm. And LA is a very spiritual city. I mean, we have the best cults here. Like we literally create cults here. It's crazy. Yeah. We have a lot of actors who need help, or just people in general who are creative who are looking for that muse. Mm-hmm. And so I've really decided that over hiatus, I want to start a coven of just women who want to come and hang out and maybe do some spells and put some intentions out there and say, this year is my year to do X, Y, Z in a very safe space, especially as my friends and I become mothers. We have a place to breastfeed and let it all hang out and just talk. And I feel like that's the most important thing is the community and what I miss from religion. So Charmed, I do a lot of spell work. I'm the one they go to, Chrissy, we need a rock that can do this. And I'm like, meteorite. Like I have the kind of running encyclopedia from my previous experience of Santeria and Wicca and just like general Catholic magic to talk about magic on the show. And my favorite shows tend to be about magic in terms of historical, relevancy and folklore. Yeah. So that's like, and also being Latin is a big thing because our three female leads are diverse and come from diverse backgrounds. And one of them is Puerto Rican. So it's really interesting. There's me and two other Latin females on the show, and one of them, including me, comes from his sisters. So when I was growing up watching Charmed, I was like, we're the Charmed ones.
Which one were you?
I don't remember. I think I was... Which one was Prue? Was she the one?
Sharon Doherty, the oldest.
Oh, the oldest, yeah. So I thought it was Prue, and then she died. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I'm Paige, the one that has the baby with Wyatt later.
No, that's Piper.
I
was Piper.
Okay, I became Piper because I was like, well, they killed off the oldest. And I like Piper.
Oh, so you were just by birth order?
Yeah. I went down the list.
That's funny.
But my sisters and I would always joke that we had the power of three, and we would go around the house and play pretend. And when I got on this show, my sisters were really, really happy. That's funny. So yeah, it's been a dream come true. Yeah,
and it sort of leads me to my next question. Do you find in your writing that there's, sometimes as writers, we're just telling the same story over and over, but different ways. So do you find that, or like, is there like a through line or themes that you see in the type of writing that you resonate with, the type of writing you do?
Totally. I would say yes. I feel one of my friends in film school was like, you write The Godfather, but in 17 different ways. I was like, oh, that's not great. And I kind of do. I write stories so all my stories thus far that have been written and sent out for meetings and stuff that my public material, Latin or Cuban female protagonists more specifically, but sometimes can be other ethnicities of Latin. But for now, I'm sticking to Cuban because I don't want to do Guatemalan and someone comes after me and I'm like, you're right, boo. Yeah. And I want to be authentic. So Cuban female protagonists. My most previous sample is called Las Lloronas, which is about a Cuban American person like myself, female, eldest daughter of 3 who comes home from New York after being estranged from her family when her father was found murdered, and trying to keep the family together in the wake of allegations and secrets and crimes that come out. And it's kind of a mafioso story. It's something I wanted to write for a long time because it takes place in a household where it's only about the females and the men are, secondary. But there are male characters, and I definitely strive to make sure that if the females are badass, the men have to be too, because it's not fair. And it's just not the way the world works, I think. And it takes place in Miami in the dynasty culture that I consider upper
Yeah.
Excuse me, upper class Miami, in which I grew up in, like the Fernandez family, the Gutierrez family.
Yeah.
You will not marry, you will not date anyone from I'm trying to remember which family it was when my dad got mad. It was a Russian family. So there's that. I find that there are topics I'm really interested in right now. Now that I'm on hiatus, I'm going to finish up some samples that have just kind of been in revision mode for Latin stuff. Like I have another one. So I like crime. I love crime stories. I love true crime. I know there's a big push within our Hollywood Latin community to do less stories of people in crime roles, whether or not they are the victim or the perpetrator, which is, I actually completely agree and understand that we need to show better stories for people across the world of Latins not being just criminals.
Yeah.
It's hard when you kind of grew up in that. And as Roger Stone says, one of my favorite quotes, he says, South Florida is a sunny place for shady people.
Yeah.
He's totally right. A lot of my friends were very sketchy in their families growing up. But so I'm like, that's the world I come from. Why would I not write it?
Yeah.
But I also love Nancy Drew and like podcasts like Generation Y. And those are things I like to write. So it's hard. But I think right now in this year in 2020, my goal is to pop out as many Latin stories within me that have, relevance to my life as possible. There's a feature I really want to try to get on the blacklist this year about a situation sort of happened in real life and then didn't. So I'm like, how do I pitch this? But my grandma has dementia and she just goes missing. So the story is like the eldest of a family coming together in the wake of their grandma missing to me is like a very emotional and like simple story to tell that would be really relevant. On the other side of that, I know that I have other parts of my life that are not necessarily rooted in Latin culture, and I really want to write a book or a pilot or a feature, I'm not even sure yet, it's very ethereal, about polyamory and all my friends who are doing polyamory in LA, and my husband and I are married and we've talked about polyamory, and so he and I are like, man, like wouldn't it be a cool story for a married couple, millennial married couple, to investigate this world through their friends and through their own experiences. And so I'm like, okay, we'll call it a millennial marriage. And it'll be like the new rom-com type thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's fun. Or I'm just going to write a series of erotic novels. Because I've always wanted to do that. I love erotic novels. And I think they're ridiculous and trashy. And I kind of want to write like a highbrow one. But I will say right now for the marketplace, I have found that whenever I go to meetings for generals or showrunner meetings, they're like, okay, so how Latin are you? Tell me about your Latin stuff, because that's what sells right now. And I'm like, oh, great. Let me take out all my trauma.
Yeah.
And so you can make money off of it, plus give me some.
Yeah, but also give you notes on it. It's
exactly.
like, that doesn't feel
trauma.
authentic to us.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. How do you say this word? Pastelito? Oh, my God. It's so hard. And then I get it. And I should lean into it. For selling purposes that will help my husband and I get a house. I get it. But there's a lot of other parts of me that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And so now I'm working on a pilot, fresh pilot called Bruta, about a Cuban American con woman living in Central Florida, and upon her mom coming to visit her as a ghost, she realizes she has a destiny to find 7 missing children in their neighborhood that have been neglected by authorities. So it's like True Detective meets Medium in a way. And the reason I'm writing the story is because a lot of my friends growing up were kidnapped. They were, what's the word? I forget. It's like aristocrats. Aristocrats, thank you. That's what they would call themselves in Spanish, coming from Colombia or Brazil or any of these Latin American countries. And they would be kidnapped there because they had money, and so they would be brought back to their parents after they were held somewhere, and some were tortured and some were not, and they would just get the money and leave. In fact, I did not know this, but AIG has kidnapping insurance for a lot of prominent families that they sell this insurance to, and my dad works in insurance with doctors and lawyers in South Miami and financial consulting, so he would tell me, hey, did you know that AIG has kidnapping insurance? Because I would tell him, oh, so-and-so got kidnapped, Dad, when she was 8 years old, but she got returned, and she's traumatized. He's like, oh, yeah, hopefully her parents had kidnapping insurance. Like,
oh
okay,
God.
Dad. But in America, if you're kidnapped, you're pretty much never going to be seen from again. And the highest rates of child sexual abuse imagery no longer being called child pornography, as well as the rates of people who are missing children are predominantly Black and Hispanic, and they are ghosts. No one sees them, and no one cares. And it's just a social topic. It's not something I'm invested in personally, that I have personal experience from, but it is something that really, really, really bothers me. And I'm very politically active, so if I can tell a story about a complicated anti-hero who is on a story of redemption, just trying to find out what happened to these kids and shed a light on how big this problem is, because it's huge. It's not something we can just take lightly anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I'm always curious of, like, from writers just to hear about the people that they admire. Mm-hmm. So, like, who are your heroes? Who are your peers? People you see working that you are a fan of? People you're Instagram stalking and just loving what they're doing from afar?
Totally. I have to say I'm going to shout out to Courtney, my old boss, Courtney Kemp, because she was the first woman of color I worked for who just blew my mind in all the right ways. Just like really inspired me to be confident and not say I'm sorry all the time, even as a nervous tick, which I still constantly do. My current boss, Liz Kruger on Charmed, is a badass as well. So those like immediate figures in my life, but also like personally, my grandma and my mom are the pillars of strength in my life because they just went through so much to be where they are today. And they don't take any bullshit from anybody, publicly and privately. Then, of course, like, I have a lot of fictional characters I look up to. And in real world characters, I would say like Tanya Sriracha for sure. Just killing it on every front. And when she became a showrunner, was running Vita, I was like, my dream exactly is to be a showrunner making Latin or female driven content that empowers young viewers, just as I was empowered watching things like The Golden Girls and The X-Files with Scully. And in terms of like Latin American authors, I'm trying to think. I read a lot of books. I still read, but I'm like totally at loss. I would say like filmmaking wise, like Luis Buñuel, he did a great movie that I love. That's one of my favorite films called The Spirit of the Beehive. That is a very famous Spanish film about a little girl using her imagination to deal with like the Spanish Civil War. And so as a little girl who used her imagination to deal with a really insane household, it was I like totally understand that movie, like on a deep level. And so, I mean, other things like Goosebumps, Nancy Drew, Lord of the Flies, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, like books that dealt with authority and said, look out for your authority figures because they'll try to kill you or screw you over, could not be more relevant to today. And things I constantly think about. My favorite films are from the conspiracy cinema of the 1970s. Parallax View, 3 Days of the Condor. Like when I realized like movies were stylistic and cinematic in a way that not only imparted a message but also made you feel something, there's a huge power in that. And then of course, like, biggest shout out to the Golden Girls and Susan Harris, who did that show and Soap, which are like my favorite shows of all time.
That's funny.
Of course I grew up on Que Pasa USA and like things that my parents would show me, like, this is a great TV show. Like Breaking Bad and Mad Men, like those are all formative things. But truly, I always tell people the biggest formative experience of my life was the Golden Girls, because Susan Harris was a female showrunner at a time when there were no female showrunners. Her son now is the biggest atheist author, Sam Harris, of all time. I did not know that till I looked up on Wikipedia, because I've been trying to get in touch with her. She's still alive for years. Like, I think she's in a retirement home in Encino or something, and I'm like just trying to talk to her to be like, can I just hang out with you for 15 minutes? I know you don't know me. I'm an avid fan of the Golden Girls.
That's funny.
My sisters and I would watch the reruns on Hallmark Channel and Lifetime in the afternoons we came home from school, and it was like my mom would say the only time we weren't trying to kill each other or fighting was when she put on the Golden Girls, because we all loved it so much and we know the theme song. And at my wedding, my sister sung the theme song for me.
Wow.
I have a book called Behind the Lanai, the unauthorized biography of the Golden Girls. I have a thing on my keychain for my keys for them. That show changed my life because it was a show about females who just hung out and talked about their periods and ate cheesecake. And they're all so empowered, and they're in their 50s or 60s, and they're still getting dick, and they're running around and living their best lives. And it just changed me in so many ways. And when it got on Hulu recently, I made my husband watch it, and he was like, this show is actually incredible. And I'm like, I know. And it dealt with really progressive issues. Some episodes don't hold up. They're definitely racist, but there are some that really hold up, and you're like, oh my God. So Susan Harris for the win. Okay.
Man, you're really obsessed. I would actually, she should watch out. I was scared for her. So, just wrapping up, where can people find you? Like, where?
My social media. I'm actually rebranding at this time. Right. I know that's like weird. But essentially, like, I am at Chrissy Fresh on IG. I will, if you go on there now, there won't be the same pictures there from 6 months from now is my plan. I'm going to reboot it. It's so mysterious. I'm going to make a new tagline for myself. And you can also find me on Facebook at Christina-Pineapple, I think, since Piña means pineapple in Spanish. Pineapple's like my logo. And then Twitter, I'm at Not Josefina, which is kind of weird. I'm rebranding. I'm going to make it all one thing eventually. So maybe I'll back in time, like go back on this podcast and rebrand myself again. But essentially, at Not Josefina was because I worked at a job where everyone would call me the housekeeper as a joke, and I did not find it funny. So I made a Twitter to be like, I am not your housekeeper at Not Josefina. I don't use it that much. Twitter seems like a black hole. Instagram is a little more fun.
Yeah.
A little more curated.
Yeah.
Facebook is just, for the family and friends. And then I don't understand what TikTok is. If China owns it, I don't want any part of it. Snapchat seems complicated.
Yeah.
I'm an older millennial. That's why I need a rebrand. I don't even brand like on a daily basis. But I am involved in a bunch of different groups that I'd like to shout out to. Women's of Cinematic Arts at USC, just an all-female group for entertainment, networking, and also empowerment. I'm one of the committee members for outreach. So if you would like to do an event with some USC ladies, we'd be open. We're very open to anything. I'm also I go to the Latin committee meetings over at the WJ. And then on hiatus, I'd like to revisit 826LA because I miss little kids. I love children. And reading to them and practicing Spanish that way will be really fun.
Yeah.
So, those are the things that I like secretly do behind the scenes. I'm really a hermit who's trying to become more of like a branded individual right now, and it's not working.
It's overrated.
It's overrated. I completely agree. But what's crazy is you get more money in negotiations for deals. Because they're like, oh, how many followers do you have as a writer?
Don't tell me this.
I know, it's terrible. And I'm like, wait, how many do I need to get more money to have a family? Like,
oh, God.
It's really dumb.
Oh, wow. All right. And so my last question.
For sure.
Is I always ask the writers to title the episode.
Oh.
So the title of your episode will go right next to your name, and the prompt for the title is a blank Latinx writer.
Okay. I came up with a few. I didn't know if they were good.
So in that blank, you can just put whatever. You can add more than one word. You can move them around. Just whatever feels like true to you, your story, this conversation, the writing you do.
So I struggled with this question, the hardest off your
This is the
list.
hardest one.
Because there's so many things. How do you define someone in a sentence? So I came up with a neurotic, superstitious Latinx writer because I have mental illness and I'm open about that. And I always joke that if Larry David if Larry David had sex with a Cuban woman, the baby would be me. I'm constantly like Mr. Magooing my way through life in like a comedic way for everyone else except myself. I have foot and mouth syndrome. I get nervous. I can't stop talking. I constantly bite my nails. I'm not the stereotype of a pretty Latin girl in Miami. I'm kind of weird and erotic. What else? I'm trying to think. An obsessive Latinx writer. Clairvoyant. My grandma's a medium. I've had really strong supernatural experiences. I wouldn't call myself a clairvoyant though. I think you need to pass a test for that. I would say an erotic spiritual Latinx writer. Yeah, kind of defines who I am.
I think that's it right there.
So we'll call it that.
That's perfect. People are going to resonate with that.
I hope so.
There's so many like witchy writers out there.
Oh no, for sure. Yeah,
so it's good that they can find another one of their own. Come to your coven. Yeah, come to the coven on Silver Lake East Side, Los Feliz. It's going to be an eclectic mix of white, brown, Black, Asian. I want women to come, and if you're not down for the rituals, totally fine. I am, but you don't have to be. And we just do prayers and like talk about our intentions and what's bothered us this week. It's more like a support group. For women, especially women who want to be writers, because we're all a little neurotic, even though we don't want to talk about it. No, I love this. There's so many different like little writers groups and communities. So I think this is very like there's an audience for it.
Totally. So I want to thank you, Ruben, for having me on, because this has been like kind of a dream come true. And I'm like trying to find more of a Latin community within our industry and also just outside of our industry, because I feel pretty alone. My lovely white husband can only do so much, and he does make arroz con pollo, like he makes ropa vieja, and it's really good. And I'm like, babe, you're doing so well. I'm Cubanizing you.
I'm jealous.
He's a good cook too. So I'm like, oh, delicious.
And
it reminds me of home. But